Affinity bias, an overlooked threat to diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. Abstract. Having a diverse, inclusive, and equitable workplace has become an important priority for many organizations today. However, diversity alone does not guarantee inclusion or equity, as unconscious biases like affinity bias can undermine efforts if left unchecked. Affinity bias refers to the tendency to form stronger connections and have more positive feelings towards others similar in attributes, stemming from cognitive processes that view similarity as trustworthy, commonly impacting opportunities in organizations. It persists due to forces like homophily naturally gravitating towards similarity, unconscious biases operating below awareness, lack of diversity allowing similarity as default, conformity pressures, and more apprehension evaluating dissimilar others. If unaddressed, negative impacts include less diverse pipelines and leadership over time, inequitable experiences and outcomes, lower innovation and problem solving, and loss of talent. Research shows affinity bias can be overcome through intentional efforts across organizational levels, including designing fair structures and systems like instituting consistent talent criteria, unconscious bias training, diverse interview panels, and anonymous screening, as well as enhancing diverse social networks through mentoring, sponsorship, and networking programs, providing ongoing DEI learning delivered to all employees on topics related to identity, privilege and inclusion, and modeling inclusive behaviors through KPIs and goals linked to diversity accountability in performance reviews, challenging exclusionary behaviors, and appointing C-level oversight. A case study demonstrates how one firm systematically addressed affinity bias threatening diversity goals through training, anonymous assessments, consultant evaluation, a new sponsorship program, and ongoing learning with leadership commitment and reporting that narrowed representation gaps and improved inclusion within 2 years. Leaders must recognize affinity bias and commit to fair processes and empowering connections to build truly inclusive cultures reflecting society. Having a diverse, inclusive, and equitable workplace has become an important priority for many organizations today. Leaders recognize the business value that diverse perspectives and experiences can bring. However, diversity alone does not guarantee inclusion or equity. In fact, without awareness, biases that impact decision-making can undermine even the most well-intentioned diversity efforts. One such bias is affinity bias, the preference we have for people who are similar to us. Today we will explore what affinity bias is, why it persists, and its negative impacts if left unchecked. What is affinity bias? Affinity bias refers to the tendency humans have to form stronger connections and have more positive feelings towards others who are similar to them in terms of attributes like gender, age, culture, or experiences. McDonald and Westphal, 2013. This liking for similarity stems from cognitive processes that lead us to perceive similarity as a sign of trustworthiness. From an evolutionary perspective, forming bonds with similar others provided survival advantages. Byrne, 1971. In organizations, affinity bias commonly occurs when hiring, promoting, mentoring, or developing employees. For example, male leaders may be more likely to mentor and sponsor other men. Ely et al. 2011. Researchers have found affinity bias exists across a variety of identity dimensions, including gender, race, orientation, background, and more. McDonald et al. 2018. McDonald, 2011. Importantly, affinity bias is often unconscious or implicit. People are generally unaware of the operation and influence of this bias on their decision-making. Greenwald and Banerjee, 1995. Why does affinity bias persist? There are a few reasons why affinity bias, despite good intentions, persists in organizational contexts. Homophily, the psychological drive for homophily. or birds of a feather flock together, means humans naturally gravitate towards similarity. McPherson et al. 2001. Affinity for similarity is reinforced through our social networks and environments. Unconscious biases. As noted, affinity bias operates implicitly below conscious awareness. We are often blind to biases that favor in-groups over out-groups. Greenwald and Banerjee, 1995. Lack of diversity. When there is little diversity within leadership or a work group, there are fewer opportunities to connect with dissimilar others. Similarity becomes the default. Schwab et al. 2015. Conformity pressures. The need to conform and gain social acceptance from one's peers can pressure individuals towards favoring similar others. Ask. 1956. Evaluation apprehension. Judging or evaluating dissimilar others induces more uncertainty and apprehension compared to similar others. Heilman. 2012. Unless actively mitigated, these psychological and social factors will ensure affinity bias persists. Awareness of why it exists is crucial to overcoming it. Negative impacts of unchecked affinity bias. Some specific negative consequences of affinity bias in organizations include less diverse pipelines and leadership, if similar others are consistently favored for opportunities. Diversity will stagnate and the representation of minority groups will not improve over time. McDonald. 2011. Inequitable experiences and outcomes. Outgroups will be less likely to receive crucial development experiences like mentoring, sponsors, or high visibility assignments. Ely et al. 2011. This perpetuates inequitable career trajectories and outcomes. Lower innovation and problem solving. Diverse teams that include varying perspectives outperform homogeneous groups on measures of innovation, problem solving, and decision making. Phillips, 2014. Affinity bias hinders realization of these benefits. Loss of talent. When inequitable treatment is noticed, high-performing minority employees may become dissatisfied and seek opportunities elsewhere. Roberts et al. 2020. This results in loss of talent, knowledge, and relationships. Legal reputational risks. Persistent affinity bias could rise to allegations of discrimination, impacting an organization's legal standing, perception as an employer of choice, and brand reputation. Clearly, affinity bias poses serious threats that leaders must address to achieve diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. The costs of inaction are too high. Strategies for mitigating affinity bias. Research demonstrates affinity bias can be overcome through intentional efforts at multiple levels of an organization. Chung et al. 2019. Some key strategies include design structures and systems that promote fairness, institutionalize fair and consistent criteria for talent processes like hiring, reviews, or promotion. Use quantitative assessments. Provide unconscious bias training to all those involved in talent processes. Train hiring managers on mitigating affinity bias. Consider using diverse interview panels and keeping applicant identifiers like name and photo anonymous until final stages. Audit all talent systems, processes, and outcomes regularly for equity. Intervene wherever inequities are found. Enhance diverse social networks. Implement mentoring, sponsorship, and networking programs to create connections across identity groups. Inkent participation. Host affinity and allyship programs for underrepresented groups and those who advocate for them. Promote opportunities for informal connections across differences, like diverse company activities. Train yourself and others through DEI learning. Provide ongoing learning for all employees on topics like identity, privilege, and advancing inclusion. Case studies make the work real. Ask senior leaders to participate in immersive experiences to truly understand DEI challenges from others' perspectives. Engage external consultants to evaluate culture and push the organization's comfort zone. New lenses are needed. Lead and model inclusive behaviors, institutionalize KPIs. Metrics and goals related to diversity, equity, and inclusion in all leaders' performance reviews and compensation. Challenge exclusionary or biased behaviors and comments immediately and respectfully. Appoint a C-suite leader responsible for stewarding the vision and oversight of DEI strategies. Allocate real resources. Regularly highlight exemplars across differences of inclusive leadership and contributions. These multifaceted strategies can help overcome affinity bias when combined with ongoing evaluation, learning and refinement. While challenging, leadership commitment is key. Case study: mitigating affinity bias at a financial services firm. One large financial services firm faced similar representation gaps and inequities, threatening their ambitious diversity targets. An internal evaluation revealed affinity bias as a root cause. Leaders took a systematic approach to address it. All people managers were trained on unconscious, implicit biases and how to mitigate affinity bias in talent processes. New decision criteria were introduced. Diverse interview panels, blind resume screening, and quantitative assessments were instituted company-wide for major talent decisions. External DEI consultants evaluated firm culture, talent data, and interviewed underrepresented employees to surface barriers. A new sponsorship program connected high potentials across gender and ethnic groups with senior allies. Participation was formally recognized. Learning programs were launched to enhance cultural competencies firm-wide and host crucial conversations to candidly discuss inclusion. Leadership made diversity a core part of their brand promise. Outcomes were regularly reported and underperformance addressed. Within 2 years, representation gaps narrowed significantly. Employee surveys showed greater inclusion. Minority retention also improved as equitable experiences increased. By addressing affinity bias head-on, with sustained commitment, this firm advanced their diversity goals. Conclusion: as the threats posed by unchecked affinity bias are serious, leaders must take proactive steps to mitigate it. A holistic, multifaceted approach is needed that addresses causes both individual and systemic. While not easy work, overcoming affinity bias is key to fulfilling diversity, equity and inclusion promises, and reaping proven business benefits. Leaders who make reducing bias through fair structures and empowering connections across differences a priority will succeed in building truly inclusive cultures where all talents thrive. Now is the time for organizations to recognize affinity bias and take meaningful action to counter it. The commitment will pay off through a diversity of voices, perspectives and outcomes that reflect the diversity of our society.